Today on Earth Focus, U.S. carbon emissions are down and bigger drops may be on the way. Earth Policy Institute's Lester Brown sees a positive trend. Coming up on Earth Focus.
Probably the most important thing happening in the world today on the climate/energy front is the decline in U.S. carbon emissions. Ever since we can remember, carbon emissions are going up. Then came the economic downturn, and after 2007, carbon emissions dropped because the economy was shrinking. What we're now seeing is that carbon emissions are continuing to drop, even though the economy has turned upward. What everyone thought was that the long-term trend in carbon emissions going up would dip a little bit with a recession and resume the upward trend. But instead of doing that, it's going up, starting to go down, and I think it's going to go down much faster than most people realize. During the last 4 years, 2007 to 2011, we've seen coal use drop by 10%, oil use by 11%. Natural gas has gone up by 6%. But on balance, carbon emissions have dropped 7% in 4 years. That's big. And this is in the largest economy in the world. We are huge in the carbon emissions business, if you will. But what's happening is that in this country, because of the de facto moratorium on new coal plants, a number have already closed, but of the 492 remaining, 71 are scheduled to close in the next few years. So coal use and carbon emissions associated with coal are going to keep dropping in the U.S. We're seeing a similar situation, but for different reasons, with oil use. In this country, the automobile fleet has grown very rapidly since World War II, until the last few years. It peaked at 250 million 2 years ago, and in each year since then has dropped a bit. And one of the reasons for that is that teenagers are not part of the automobile culture in the way that my generation was, for example. They don't socialize with cars or pickup trucks as we did in rural communities. They live in cities. They're not so automobile dependent, and they socialize, not in cars, but with smartphones, the internet, the social media. It's a very different world, and that's why there are fewer teenage drivers in this country today, about 10 million, than there were in 1980, about 12 million. So even though our population is much larger, the number of teenagers who are getting driver's licenses is much smaller. On the other end of the age spectrum, I call this the demographics of gasoline use, the largest age groups in our society are the baby boomers, those who were born immediately after World War II. They are now just reaching retirement. When people retire, their gasoline use drops by 30% to 50%. The Obama administration has increased the fuel efficiency of cars dramatically in the projected requirements. The average car sold in 2025 will use only half as much gasoline as the average car sold in 2010, last year. The result is declining carbon emissions. They've dropped 7% in the last 4 years. My guess is that they will drop by 20% or more by 2020. That is between 2007 and 2020. That's good news for the world to have carbon emissions in the largest economy going down, and it could put the U.S. back in a leadership position in the climate issue. One of the concerns I have with the scientific community is that as the years have passed, it's become clear that they've been much too conservative in their projections of the effects of rising CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. If you ask some simple questions like, how much and how fast do we have to cut carbon emissions if we want to save the Greenland ice sheet? Why do we want to save the Greenland ice sheet? Because if we lose it, sea level goes up 23 feet. Manhattan is history, and dozens of others, coastal cities around the world. This is serious business. And if you ask that question, then it's clear it's not cutting carbon emissions 80% by 50-50, which is what political leaders like to talk about. It's cutting carbon emissions 80% by 2020. And that really comes down to something approaching a wartime mobilization. You can't just sit around and hope it's going to happen. It's going to take action. And the good news is that in this country, we're now at least headed in the right direction. Not fast enough yet, in my opinion, but we're not going up, we're going down. And that's the first assignment, was to change the direction of the trend. We've done that now. Now the question is, can we accelerate that trend much more in the years ahead? My sense is that internationally negotiated climate agreements have become obsolete, and we haven't realized it. For one thing, they take time. They take years to plan for, and even if you're successful, it takes several more years to ratify by the requisite number of countries for them to fully take effect. We don't have that much time anymore. We've got to move fast. The other thing that happens is that an interesting sort of pattern has developed where the delegations that represent countries consist mostly of diplomats and lawyers. When was the last time you saw a large group of diplomats and lawyers come up with a bold new idea? Why don't we send our climate scientists, our visionaries, our environmental leaders? Why don't we send the people who would try to see which country can do the most rather than which country, can do the least? I think the important things happening that are going to determine whether we make it or not are being made by national governments in some cases, by local governments, by NGOs, by groups of corporations. I would cite, for example, the corporations in Europe, led by Munich Re, Deutsche Bank, Siemens, a number of other well-known companies, came together and created the Desertec, which is a potentially massive plan to tap the solar resources of North Africa and to build a grid that would integrate the solar resources of North Africa and the wind resources of the North Sea into the same system. I mean, the Algerians point out they have enough harnessable solar energy in their desert to power the world economy. So we're looking at potentially hundreds of thousands of solar megawatts of solar generating capacity there. Another important thing has happened in China. The Chinese launched what they call their wind base project. They now have large wind farms, wind generating complexes with at least 10,000 megawatts each. To put that in perspective, 10,000 megawatts is far larger than any coal or nuclear power generating facility in the world. It's several times as large as most of them. So within the energy sector, we've seen wind now scale up to levels we've never seen before. I mention this just to give a sense of what's happening. Everyone focuses on coal in China, and rightly so. They're still building coal plants, but they've got some huge wind things underway. And they're the world leader in wind now. They've already passed the United States. My sense is we're undergoing a bit of a cultural change now, and we see many manifestations of it. We see it with the bicycle. Here in Washington, D.C., we now have a bike share program. Chicago is launching a huge bike share program. Mayor Bloomberg in New York is launching a 10,000 bike share program for New York City. I think it's being launched this month in December. People have begun to rethink the bicycle, and even people who own bicycles are thinking, maybe I ought to use my bike more, and use taxis less or what have you. But there's a change in mindset going on. The idea that carbon emissions could be falling in this country is such a novel idea. I mean, it's counter to what we think, what we've been worried about for decades now, and suddenly to have it change is kind of difficult to make that adjustment. It's taking a little while for it to take root and for people to realize that it is actually happening. It is true. It's not some fluke in the trend or something, or in the numbers. It's an actual new trend that's going to change things for all of us.
Now on U.S. airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories. World news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.